quarterly close was in 4 hours. I had my laptop open, 3 spreadsheets running side by side, and a cold cup of coffee I'd been meaning to reheat since 7 in the morning. The conference room on the 14th floor was filling up. I could see them through the glass. The board members, the outside auditors from Deloitte, and 2 people I didn't recognize in dark suits sitting at the far end of the table. My boss's assistant had emailed me at 6:45 a.m. Bring everything. The full trail. Q3 and Q4 both. I've been at Hargrove Capital for 11 years. 11 years of quarterly closes, 11 years of building the financial infrastructure from a 4-person startup into a mid-market private equity firm managing over $2 billion in assets. I knew every formula in every model. I knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically. I knew which deal had closed late because the wire cleared on a Friday at 4:58 p.m. I knew which investor had a side letter that wasn't in the main data room. I knew all of it because I had built all of it. And I was about to walk into that room and present the cleanest audit result this firm had ever produced. I gathered my folders, my laptop, my backup drive. I had printed copies because our CFO, my CFO, the man I had reported to for 6 of my 11 years, had retired in September. His replacement had started 8 weeks ago. I'll call him my new boss because that's what the org chart said, even though nothing about the dynamic felt like a normal reporting relationship. He was brought in from the outside. A guy with a resume full of buzzwords and a handshake that lasted 2 seconds too long. He had a habit of standing in my doorway and asking questions he already knew the answers to, just to see how I'd respond. I had been professional, polite, thorough. I had also started forwarding key emails to my personal account 3 weeks after he arrived. Not because I planned to use them, because 11 years teaches you to pay attention to your instincts. I walked into the conference room at 8:52 a.m., 8 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start. The board chair, a woman in her 60s who had known me since my 2nd year at the firm, nodded when I came in. The Deloitte lead stood and shook my hand. The 2 people in dark suits didn't move. My new boss was already seated at the head of the table. He looked at me when I came in, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like he'd been expecting me to be somewhere else. I set up my laptop, connected to the display, and pulled up the first slide. 12 months of clean numbers, reconciled to the penny. $340 million in Q4 transactions, all documented, all verified, all tied back to source. The Deloitte team had pre-reviewed everything 2 weeks prior. We had one open item, a timing difference on a foreign currency hedge, and I had a 1-page memo explaining it, with sign-off from outside counsel. I started presenting. I got through the first 6 slides without interruption. The board chair was taking notes. The auditors were nodding. I was 2 sentences into slide 7 when my new boss put his hand up. "Let me stop you there." I stopped. He looked at the board, not at me. "Before we go further, I want to flag a concern I've been sitting with for several weeks." He paused. He was the kind of person who used pauses like punctuation. There are some irregularities in the Q3 reconciliation that I don't think have been adequately explained. And I have to be honest with you all, I'm not comfortable signing off on this audit presentation until we have more clarity. The room was quiet. I looked at him. "Which irregularities?" He opened a folder. He had a printed document, highlighted in yellow. He slid a copy toward the board chair and toward the Deloitte lead. He did not slide one to me. There are 14 line items in the Q3 close where the original journal entry doesn't match the final reported figure. The variance is small, but the pattern concerns me. He looked at the board again. 11 of those 14 entries were approved by one person. He let that sit in the air. The board chair looked up. Who approved them? My new boss looked at me then. Finally. She did. I don't remember deciding to stay calm. I just was. 11 years of quarterly closes. 11 years of being the person in the room who does not flinch when numbers are wrong. Because flinching costs you credibility, and credibility is the only currency that matters in a room like that. May I see the document? I asked. He hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. Then he slid a copy across the table. I looked at the 14 line items. I recognized every single one of them. 13 were standard reclassification entries, routine accounting adjustments made during the close process, every one of them within policy, every one of them documented in the work papers the Deloitte team had already reviewed and cleared. The 14th was the foreign currency hedge timing item, the one I had a memo for. I looked up. These are reclassifications. They're in the work papers. The work papers that you prepared, he said. Yes. And that Deloitte reviewed and signed off on 2 weeks ago. I looked at the Deloitte lead, correct? The Deloitte lead had been quiet through all of this. She was a careful woman, early 40s, short grey streak in her hair, the kind of auditor who never says anything she hasn't already thought through twice. She looked at the document my new boss had distributed. She looked at her own copy of the work papers. She said, "The items on this list are all in the pre-reviewed file. We cleared 13 of them. The 14th has an open memo." "Which I have here," I said. I pulled the one-page memo from my folder and passed it to the board chair. My new boss adjusted in his seat. "Regardless," he said, "I think we need to pause this presentation. The integrity of the process. The integrity of the process," the board chair said quietly, "is what I'm trying to understand right now." She looked at him, then at me, then back at him. "What exactly are you alleging?" "I'm not alleging anything. I'm raising a concern." "Then raise it specifically." He looked uncomfortable for the first time. "I think there may have been intentional misstatement in the Q3 numbers, and I think the audit presentation should be postponed until an independent review can be conducted." There it was. The room was very quiet. I felt something in my chest. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. A particular stillness that comes when you realize the moment you've been half expecting has actually arrived. One of the men in dark suits leaned forward. I found out later he was from the firm's outside legal counsel. "That's a significant claim," he said to my new boss. "Do you have documentation supporting intentional misstatement?" "I have the 14 line items, which have been explained and cleared," the Deloitte lead said. She was not looking at him warmly. "I'd like to call a short recess," my new boss said. He looked at me, "And I think it would be appropriate for you to step out while the board confers." I looked at the board chair. She looked at me for a moment. Something passed between us. I don't know how to describe it exactly. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who has been in enough rooms to know when something else is going on. "Give us 10 minutes, she said to me, not unkindly. I took my laptop and my folders and I walked out. The hallway outside the 14th floor conference room had a row of windows facing east. The city was bright that morning, November. Clear sky, the kind of cold that looks warm from inside a glass building. I stood at the window, and I did not cry and I did not panic. I thought about 11 years. I thought about the backup drive in my bag. I thought about the emails I had forwarded to my personal account. I thought about one email in particular. 6 weeks ago, during the Q3 close process, I had found an anomaly, not in my numbers, in a set of entries that had been posted to the system using the CFO override credentials. My old CFO had retired. His credentials should have been deactivated. They hadn't been. Someone had used them to post 4 journal entries in the last 2 days of September, just before the quarter closed. The entries moved a combined total of $2.3 million between 2 internal cost centers in a way that, if you weren't looking carefully, would reduce a performance fee liability by enough to affect one specific fund's reported return. I had flagged it. Internally. First, I sent an email to my new boss asking him to review the entries and confirm authorization. He had replied in 2 sentences. Those were transitional adjustments. I'll handle the documentation. He never produced documentation. 3 days later, I sent the original email, the anomaly, the entry details, the override credentials log to our outside legal counsel. Quietly, with a note that said, "I want this on record. I'm not sure yet what it means, but I want someone outside the firm to have eyes on it. I had not told anyone else. I stood at the window for 9 minutes. Then the conference room door opened and the board chair stepped out. She looked at me. "Come back in." I went back in. My new boss was still seated. The two men in dark suits had moved closer together. The Deloitte lead had her laptop open. One of the board members, a man who had barely spoken all morning, was on his phone, turned slightly away from the table. The board chair sat down. She folded her hands. "We've asked for the system access log from IT," she said. "For Q3, the full log." My new boss said nothing. "It'll take about 20 minutes to pull," she continued. "While we wait, I want to ask a direct question." She looked at my new boss. "The CFO override credentials, the ones that were used to post entries on September 28th and 29th. Do you know anything about that?" The silence was different from the silence before. He said, "I don't know what you're referring to." One of the men in dark suits opened his own folder. He slid a printed email across the table to the board chair. She read it. She looked up at me. "You sent this to outside counsel 6 weeks ago?" "Yes." "Why outside counsel? Why not internal?" "Because the entries were posted using credentials that should have been deactivated, and because my internal email would be accessible to anyone with admin rights in our system." I paused. "Including whoever used the override credentials." The board member who had been on his phone set it down. He looked at my new boss. "The IT log is going to show who accessed the system on those dates," he said. "The login timestamps, the IP address, the entry codes, all of it." My new boss said, "I'd like to speak with counsel before this goes any further." The board chair looked at him for a long moment. "That's your right." She looked at one of the men in dark suits who nodded and stood. She looked at me. "You're not dismissed. Sit tight." I sat. My new boss was escorted out of the conference room at 9:41 a.m. He did not look at me when he left. The next 40 minutes were the strangest of my professional life. The IT log came through at 10,008. The system access entries on September 28th and 29th had been made from an IP address registered to a laptop issued to my new boss. The override credentials had been accessed using a temporary admin account that he had requested from IT on his 3rd day at the firm, ostensibly to audit legacy system access. IT had granted it without flagging it because he was the incoming CFO. He had never closed the access request. The Deloitte lead pulled up the 4 journal entries. She walked the board through them slowly. The combined effect was a $2.3 million reduction in a performance fee liability for one specific fund. That fund had a year-end hurdle rate. Without the liability adjustment, the fund would have fallen just short of its hurdle. With the adjustment, it cleared, which triggered a carry payment to the fund's general partner. The board member who had been on his phone said very quietly, "Who is the GP on that fund?" The board chair said, "Pull the fund documents." I had already pulled them. I'd had them in my bag for 2 weeks. I set the folder on the table without a word. The GP entity listed on the fund documents was a Delaware LLC formed 4 months before my new boss joined the firm. The registered agent address was a mail forwarding service in Wilmington. It would take time, lawyers, subpoenas, forensic accountants to untangle who actually controlled the LLC. But the timing was not subtle. The board chair looked at the folder for a long time. Then she looked at me. "How long have you had this?" 2 weeks, I said. I wasn't certain what it meant. I wanted to be sure before I brought it forward, but you sent the email to outside counsel 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago I knew something was wrong. 2 weeks ago I knew what it was. She nodded slowly. She looked at the Deloitte lead. "Can you clear the audit presentation as originally prepared?" The Deloitte lead said, "The 14 items the former CFO raised were all pre-cleared. The Q3 and Q4 financials as presented are clean. The issue is the 4 entries posted with the override credentials which will need to be reversed and restated. How long will that take?" If we start today, we can have a clean, restated close by end of week. The board chair looked to the remaining board members. Something passed between them. The kind of wordless communication that happens in rooms where people have sat together through enough hard decisions. She looked at me. "You've been here 11 years, she said. "Yes." "You built the reconciliation framework we're currently using." "Yes." "You flagged this before it became a scandal. Before the year end. Before the carry payment processed." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "The CFO position is currently vacant, effective about 90 seconds ago." She said it without any particular inflection, like she was reading from a calendar. "The board will need to appoint an interim while we conduct a proper search." She paused. "I'd like to recommend you for interim CFO. The board will vote, of course, but I want to ask you directly first. Are you willing?" I had not expected that sentence. I want to be honest about that. I had walked into the building that morning thinking about the quarterly close. I had thought about the backup drive and the emails, yes, thought about them the way you think about an umbrella you've packed because the forecast said possible rain, hoping you won't need it, prepared if you do. But I had not been sitting in that hallway for 9 minutes imagining this moment. "Yes," I said, "I'm willing." The board voted at 11:15 a.m., 5-0. The board chair called me back in from the hallway where I'd been waiting and told me the result. She shook my hand. So did the Delight lead. One of the board members, the quiet one, said, "Good work," which, from a man who speaks in 3-word sentences, I understood was significant. I walked back to my office. My desk looked the same as it always had. The cold coffee from that morning was still there. I drank it. My assistant knocked on the doorframe 10 minutes later. She'd heard from someone, the way officers always hear things before any official announcement. Her eyes were wide. "Is it true?" "It's true." She sat down in the chair across from my desk. "What do you need?" I thought about it. "Find me the fund documents for the carry payment, the one that was going to trigger. I want to make sure the reversal is clean before anything processes." She nodded. "On it." She started to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, I knew something was off about him. From week 1. "I know," I said. "Me too." The formal announcement went out to the firm at 2 p.m. My new boss's departure was described as a separation by mutual agreement, effective immediately. The board chair signed the email herself. There was no mention of the override credentials or the LLC or the performance fee. That would come later in stages through the appropriate legal channels. Things like that always do. I got 47 emails in the first hour. Most of them were from colleagues I'd worked alongside for years. Some of them were from people at other firms. Word travels fast in a world where everyone went to the same 3 business schools. One of them was from my old CFO, the one who had retired in September. He wrote, "I heard. I always said you were ready. Congratulations, and I'm sorry you had to get there this way." I wrote back, "Thank you. I'll try to deserve it." What I didn't write but thought, I've been ready for 4 years. What I needed was for the right set of circumstances to make it visible to the people who needed to see it. That's not a comfortable thing to say out loud. It sounds either arrogant or ruthless, and it was neither. It was just true. I had done the work. I had built the systems. I had documented everything, not because I was plotting, but because that's what rigorous people do. And when someone tried to use the shadows of a system I had built to hide something, they picked the wrong system. Because I knew where every light switch was. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything. The person who came in and tried to tear down what I had built, he didn't actually know what I had built. He saw the title below my name and assumed he understood the scope of what I did. He saw a woman who had been in the same role for 11 years and decided that meant I was overdue to be pushed aside. He didn't ask questions. He didn't read the audit work papers before he flagged them in front of the board. He made assumptions about who I was, based on what he could see on the surface, and he acted on those assumptions without doing his homework. That was his mistake. And it was a significant one. I am not a person who celebrates another person's downfall. Genuinely. Whatever happens to him legally, and my understanding is that the investigation is ongoing, I don't derive anything from it. What I keep coming back to is something simpler. I documented everything because that's how I work. I flagged the anomaly because that's what the anomaly required. I went to outside counsel because that was the appropriate channel. I walked into that conference room prepared because preparation is the only thing that has ever reliably protected me. None of it was a trap. I was just doing my job. It turned out that was enough. My first board meeting as interim CFO was scheduled for the second week of December. I prepared for it the same way I had prepared for every other presentation in 11 years, methodically, completely, without shortcuts. I printed backup copies. I had the numbers memorized 3 days in advance. I arrived 8 minutes early. The board chair looked up when I walked in. She said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning. I have the restatement package, the clean Q4 close, and a recommended framework for strengthening the system access controls going forward." I set the folders on the table. "We can start wherever the board would like." She smiled. "Just barely. Let's start at the beginning." I opened my laptop, and I did what I have always done. I got to work. I've thought about that morning a lot since then. Not the vote, not the handshakes, not the email that went out at 2 p.m. with my name in a new title. I think about the moment I was standing in the hallway by the east-facing windows, looking out at the city in November light, knowing what was in my bag and choosing to stay calm. Navi tells you that 11 years of doing your job well, really well, without shortcuts, without ego, without cutting corners because no one's watching, is itself a form of protection. It doesn't feel like that when you're building it. It feels like discipline or habit, or just the way you were raised to work. You document things because that's the right way to do things. You flag anomalies because that's what the anomaly requires. You go to outside counsel when the internal channels feel compromised. Not because you're strategic, but because you're honest and you know the difference between the two. And then one day, someone walks into your building with a title above yours and a set of assumptions about who you are, and they make a decision that unravels everything they were trying to do, because they never bothered to learn what you actually built. That's what happened. My new boss saw what was visible on the surface and acted on it. He didn't read the work papers before he flagged them in front of the board. He used credentials he shouldn't have touched to move money he had no right to move, inside a system I had spent years making traceable. He thought he understood the architecture. He didn't. He didn't know what he didn't know, and that gap between what he assumed and what was actually true is exactly where everything collapsed for him. I don't think there's anything mystical about that. It's not fate, it's just consequence. When you act without doing the work, you create exposure. When you cut corners, you leave marks. When you assume that the person you're dismissing doesn't have eyes on everything you're doing, you are placing a very large bet on a very thin read of the situation. He lost that bet, not because I set a trap, because I did my job. There's something worth sitting with in that, I think, for anyone who has ever been the person in the room who knows more than their title suggests. The temptation, and I understand it, is to feel like the work isn't enough. That visibility matters more. That the people who get ahead are the ones who are louder, who take up more space, who make sure everyone knows what they're doing. And sometimes that's true. The workplace is not a perfectly fair system, and I won't pretend it is. But what I learned, what I lived, is that when someone comes for you, when the moment actually arrives, all that quiet work becomes your entire defense. The documentation, the paper trail, the email you sent 6 weeks ago to someone outside the building, the backup drive in your bag. None of it was ammunition. All of it was just rigor. And rigor, when someone tries to use shadows against you, turns into light. The board chair asked me if I was willing. I said yes, and then I went back to my desk and drank cold coffee and started working, because that's what the job required. It still does. Every day, that part hasn't changed.